Deep dives and blue skies. Welcome back to Talking Blue with Nick, the best Dodgers analytical podcast that you can find.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Talking Blue, the best Dodgers analytical podcast that you can find. I'm your host, Nick. Today, you are listening to episode 78 of Talking Blue, the first episode of Talking Blue in 2026. Happy New Year, happy holidays to everyone out there listening. I hope you guys had a really good holiday season, a really good New Year. Like I said, it's the new year. It's 2026. 2025 is a thing of the past. It is now onward to 2026 here on Talking Blue. The Major League Baseball season will begin in a couple months, spring training, all that stuff. But today, as you guys can see by the title of the video, we are talking about two players and the possibility of them signing with the Dodgers. How do they fit in? All that kind of stuff. Kyle Tucker and Bichette. Yes, the free agents, Tucker from the Cubs, Bichette from the Blue Jays. They are still out there. Like I said, it's January 4th at the time of the recording of this video. So there's a lot of free agents unsigned. So before we get into all that, as always, you can get this podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Turn on the notifications so you don't miss any of the videos dropping. You can follow us, like I said, on Talking Blue on X. You can follow myself at Talking Blue Nick, also on X. Do a lot of tweeting about the Dodgers. If any of these players sign with the Dodgers, or if we get any kind of Dodger news, I'll be tweeting about it, giving my thoughts, breaking it down. If you guys remember my last podcast, I talked about the Edwin Diaz signing, which was about 3 weeks ago. I did make a video, or I should say a little bit of a X post kind of talking about what Diaz does and what makes him good. So you can go to Talking Blue Nick on X, and you can see that post if you don't know much about Edwin Diaz, formerly of the Mets. And you can also follow us on Reddit as well at competitive-week8715. So before we get into it again, Happy New Year to everyone. I hope you guys all had a good holiday season. I got some cool Dodger stuff. I don't know if you could see it in the video, but I got this cool Dodgers World Series shirt that I'm wearing. Got some other cool Dodger stuff here. Got this nice cup with my name on it. I got this nice picture right here. Let me see. Turn this around for the YouTube people. Right there. See if you could see that. That's the Dodgers celebrating the final out of the 25 World Series. So got some cool stuff here that's going to be going up from my pod on my desk and all that stuff. Obviously, you could see the Dodgers light that we got turned on in the back. So, of course, as you guys know, MLB offseason is a long grind. It's basically been over 2 months now as we are here in early January, the early days of January. 2 months. There's still a lot of really good free agents left. Not a lot of trades have happened. I still think there's going to be a point in the off season where a good amount of trades heat up. Currently, right now, as I checked X before I hopped on here, it looked like the Yankees were close to acquiring Edward Cabrera of the Marlins. So maybe some trades begin to happen. It's been definitely a quiet couple of weeks, kind of like off season has been stalled in terms of signings and news. Really since we left the winter meetings, and guys like obviously Edwin Diaz signed and Kyle Schwarber, but then after that, Pete Alonso did sign. Then there was a couple other little moves, but then other than that, it's pretty much been at a quiet standstill. Pretty much with the exception of the three Japanese players that were posted: Murataka, Murakami, Kazuma Okamoto, and then the pitcher Tatsui Imai. Apologize if I am butchering the pronouncing of those names. I've obviously heard a lot about them and read a lot of those names, but I haven't had a lot of practice actually pronouncing those names, like we're so used to saying Shohei Ohtani, Yoshinobu Yamamoto, Roki Sasaki. So Murakami, Okamoto, and Imai. Part of those guys signing is why we're going to talk about Tucker and Bichette and why they're possibilities. But again, just before I get into that, the three Japanese players, I thought it was interesting. All three Japanese players signed to very unexpected teams, and like none of the teams that they were kind of rumored to be like a fit on, all for different reasons. And it just kind of shows, I always feel like the market will show you what they think of you, good or bad. There are players that get that are a little, undervalued, and you might be, a little unexpected when you hear that they have a big market and multiple teams are going in on them and they get a little bit more money. Kind of like Dylan Cease is a good example of that this offseason. He got over $200 million, and he was a guy who had an ERA over 4 last year, which I'm not a big ERA batting average guy. I think that's it's proven that those numbers, you shouldn't just look at ERA and batting average to see why a player is good. But at the end of the day, he did have an ERA over 4 and didn't have like the greatest season and still got over $200 million. That's a perfect example of a team giving a player a lot of money, thinking that there is a lot in the tank per se. And then there are other players that end up getting nowhere near what you would have thought. And it's a little surprising with these Japanese players. Murakami was the biggest one who's been headlined and talked about really for the last 3 or 4 years, coming over from Japan. And he, of course, ended up signing with the White Sox, one of the worst teams in the game. There was a lot of concerns with him, and it did seem like there was a lot of misinformation about him, about how bad his swing and miss numbers are. But none of the big teams were in on him. Murakami, like I said, went to the White Sox. It kind of seemed like his market was a little difficult from the start, like what teams would be in on him. But I always ultimately thought like the Red Sox were a good fit, the Mariners, maybe the Mets, given their needs on the corner. Maybe some other team, like maybe the Padres. Again, he ended up going to the White Sox. Tatsui Mai, another guy who had... There were talks about him also getting a $200 million contract, which I thought was a little bit, crazy. He ended up only signing for, I think, 3 years, $43 million, so not even close to that. And it was rumored that he was, teams like obviously he's a pitcher, so it could have been anyone, but teams like the Cubs, the Giants, also the Padres, maybe the Yankees, Mets, those kind of teams. And he ended up signing with the Houston Astros, shocker. And then the last one, Kazuma Okamoto, another corner infielder like Murakami, but Murakami is more of a first baseman, DH. Okamoto can play third and first base and has actually been, is supposed to be a pretty good defensive player. He signs with the Toronto Blue Jays. He was another guy that was rumored for teams like the Pirates, also maybe the Red Sox and the Mets, also the Padres. He ends up going to the Blue Jays. So all three of those guys had they were different kind of players. Murakami has the highest ceiling of a guy who could hit 40, 50 home runs in a season. Okamoto is more of a kind of like a safety net. Like he doesn't really have that potential of power, but he does profile as someone who's going to make contact, have some pop, good plate discipline. Like he should come over and definitely be a solid big leaguer. Imai is a little up and down. When he first was posted and there was a lot of rumors about him, it sounded like he was a guy that was going to be similar to Yamamoto, not like $300 million, but like a very good pitcher that a lot of teams were going to be in on. But then it sounded like when it got closer to his posting and, like when it was time for him to make a decision, it seemed like there were not as many teams in on him. So anyways, that has nothing to do with a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today. But I just thought that was all interesting. And one of those players signing, and that player is Okamoto signing with the Blue Jays, does kind of make things a little bit more interesting for the Dodgers. So, of course, Kyle Tucker, Bo Bichette. Kyle Tucker is the best player on this free agent market. And I talked to you guys earlier in the offseason about, Tucker as a real possibility for the Dodgers. Of course, ultimately, I said I don't believe he will end up as a Dodger. I always thought the Blue Jays, ironically, who are having a massive offseason, I always thought he would end up there because I think that they would be one of the only teams that would be like really willing to hand him that big contract. But I did paint a scenario where it was possible where a lot of other teams kind of go different directions. Cody Bellinger signing with the Yankees or the Mets. All these other teams going other directions. Maybe the Blue Jays bring back Bichette. And it kind of leaves Tucker in a spot where he doesn't have many options. And maybe, just maybe, the Dodgers swoop in with a little bit of a shorter deal, some opt-outs mixed in there, maybe like a 5-6 year deal, maybe even 3-4 year deal, maybe something like 4 years, $140 million, something crazy. I don't even know the AAV on that. That might not be possible, but something like that, where he gets a lot of opt-outs. There's been players the last couple of years who have signed deals like that, Cody Bellinger being one of them with the Cubs. I think he signed a 3-year deal that had opt-outs after each one. Opted in after the first year of the contract, and then he was eventually traded to the Yankees, and then he opted out earlier this offseason. He's now a free agent. Alex Bregman, who signed last year with the Red Sox, again, it was a little bit of a weird case, but got a multi-year deal with the Red Sox with opt-outs, opted out. He's also currently a free agent. So I could see something like that for Tucker, and that's why I thought it was always a possibility with the Dodgers. But as the offseason has played out, there is one player out there that I actually think is more likely, and I do think there's a legit shot, and he's a player that I really like a lot, and that's Bo Bichette. We're going to talk more about Bo Bichette. If you guys want to hear my thoughts on Kyle Tucker, you can go back a couple pods ago. It was my off-season preview where I broke down Kyle Tucker and how it was possible. Again, I'll talk about it a little, but I already kind of just painted out the scenario of how it was possible. And really just the final kind of thoughts on Tucker is just that he is still out there, and it seems like he doesn't have like the biggest of markets now. I do think ultimately he's going to go to the Blue Jays because I do think it's kind of clear the Blue Jays are just spending a lot of money and they want to get as much play. They're getting as many impact players as they can, and I do think it's possible that Tucker, like Blue Jays probably have a contract on the table right now for Tucker. Maybe it's not fully what he would like. From most of my research, Tucker is still projected to get a contract about $400 million, 10 years. So I wouldn't be shocked if the Blue Jays have an offer like that on the table. Again, the Blue Jays might be aware that he doesn't have as big a market as he was hoping. So maybe they have a contract on the table for $350 or something like that. And Kyle Tucker is trying to do better than that. And maybe that's why he hasn't signed as of yet. But I would imagine that the Blue Jays probably have an offer on the table that Tucker likes, and he is just waiting to see if anyone else is willing to match it, get close to it, something like that. So I do think that's where he ultimately will sign. But it is interesting that he's still out there. There's kind of a little bit of some weird stuff with Tucker. Like, I think he's being a little undervalued. I actually think he's a very, very good player. Like, legitimately one of the best 15, 20 players in the game. And when he's healthy, he's probably closer to a top 10 player. But he's been banged up a tad bit the last 2 years. And he is kind of like a quiet, player who doesn't show a bunch of emotion. And that has nothing to do with him getting a big deal or anything like that. But I just feel like he is one of the more underrated like superstars in the game, considering like the numbers that he puts up and how good he is and his age. So I just wonder if he's being undervalued a little bit when, he is a legit superstar who is like, I don't know if he's like, in the $400 million range to me. I think that's more of a mix of like the way contracts are nowadays when like, we saw Juan Soto a year ago get such a massive deal. So Kyle Tucker, and his agent are naturally thinking like, Tucker is only a couple of years older than Soto. So of course he's not going to get $700 million like that. But given his age and how good he is, it's natural that they think, well, why can't we get $400 million? I don't know that, I think that the contract Mike Trout signed, which again was 6 years ago at this point, was for $420. Like, I don't think Tucker is as good as like Mike Trout was in his prime, but it's just the way that, evolution and, inflation and all that. But anyways, Tucker is a real possibility for the Dodgers. And if this continues, where we get into mid-January, late January, February. I could really see it happening with the Dodgers. But I just think that, like I said, he is going to have offers on the table that he does like. Like if you're Kyle Tucker, would you take a 5-year deal with a bunch of opt-outs for like $100-something million with the Dodgers? Or would you rather just take $370 million over 11 years from the Blue Jays? Either way, you're going to go to probably the two best teams in the game who just played in the World Series. You're going to get your money. You're going to be the best player, one of the best players on the team. So really the player that I wanted to talk about today, in comparison to Tucker, is Bo Bichette. Because in my two previous podcasts where I talked about offseason preview, and then we talked about Edwin Diaz, and then just kind of the swirling rumors of that time, which was like 3 weeks ago, we didn't really mention Bo Bichette. So Bo Bichette's been an interesting guy. So if you don't know much about Bo Bichette, I'll just quickly. Shortstop who is in his late 20s. He's actually pretty young still. Bo Bichette, I believe, will turn 28 in March. So on opening day next year, he will be 28 years old. Bo Bichette made his debut in 2019 as a shortstop, 21 years old. Before he dealt with injuries the last couple of years, he was about as consistent as a hitter in the game as you're going to get. So 2019, he broke into the big leagues. He only played in 46 games, so there's no point in giving like his season totals, but he put up a 930 OPS in those 46 games. He absolutely raked. 2020, the shortened COVID season, he only played in 29 games, but 840 OPS. So the 3 years that you should look at, really 4 years because of last season, but this shows how consistent he was. 2021, 2022, 2023. He played in 159 games, 159 games, 135 games. He had an OPS of 828, 802, and 814. He had 29 home runs, 24 home runs, 20 home runs. 2024 is when he started to have injury problems. So I thought that he had knee issues in 2024, but I actually think it was just calf issues. 2025, last year, is when he had the knee issues. But he actually played more games in 2025 than I realized. 139 games. So that is pretty much a full season. I mean, you would like, a little bit more, but that isn't a full injury-plagued season. Like 139 games is pretty good. 139 games, he had an 840 OPS. He hit 18 home runs. So if you don't know like Bo Bichette's style, he is like, if I were to compare him to like hitters on the Dodgers, it would kind of be more of like a Teoscar Hernandez, but with better batting average. So he is pretty much if he's going to play a full season and be healthy, he's pretty much a lock to hit close to 300, like 290 or higher. He's going to have a slugging percentage in the mid 400s, and he's going to have an OPS in the low 800s. That is an elite hitter. That is a legit all-star hitter. Silver slugger caliber hitter, not necessarily an MVP. That's key. Those are kind of numbers like a tad below like MVP numbers. But before the injuries he's had the last 2 seasons, he was a lock to play a full season, play every day, post every day, accumulate a lot of WAR, considering that he's a shortstop and that he's a really good hitter. The only issue and kind of negative about Bo Bichette, other than I guess the injuries the last 2 years, is that he's pretty much an atrocious defender as a shortstop. He's never been an above-average shortstop defensively. If you go and look at his defensive metrics, ever since he broke into the league, 2020 he was a pretty solid defender, but that was obviously the shortened season. 2021, 8th percentile in outs above average. 2022 he was in the 6th percentile. 2023 he was in the 19th percentile. And then actually in 2025 he was in the 1st percentile. So basically, when it comes to defensive shortstops, he's one of the worst in the league. He is not a good defensive shortstop. But as you guys know, the World Series came around this year. He ended up coming back from his knee issue. And what happened? He slid over to second base for the first time in his big league career. Obviously, it was just in the World Series, and he didn't even play all of those 7 games. But he actually did look pretty comfortable if you watched him out there, considering that he was literally dealing with like that knee issue that he was battling through. He made a couple of nice defensive plays. If you watch Bo Bichette, he's a smooth guy. He's very athletic, very coordinated. He's just not like super fast. Doesn't have like a cannon of an arm, and it's just not a good. There's just there are some guys that are just, even though they play infield and even though they're kind of like smooth, athletic kind of guys, they still don't really play good defense. It doesn't really translate metrically to becoming a good defensive player, good defensive shortstop. That's what Bo Bichette is. And this knee issue that he had could be a blessing in disguise in terms of his like defensive ability. Him sliding over to second base makes him one of the better second basemen in the game. Now, it is still unknown in his free agency if he will sign as a shortstop or a second baseman. I always thought ultimately he's going to sign as a second baseman. It just makes sense to me coming off the injuries. Obviously, when you're a shortstop, you want to stay at shortstop. You always hear guys, their pride. No shortstop wants to go over to third base or go to second base. They want to stay at shortstop. But if you're Bo Bichette and you've been dealing with these injuries the last 2 years, and you, I would imagine, are aware that the defensive metrics don't necessarily favor you. Obviously, Bo Bichette doesn't play the position thinking that he's a horrible defensive shortstop. But I would imagine that he knows that the metrics don't necessarily favor him, and that all 30 teams know that. And it would be a smart decision to go over to second base. When you're a shortstop like him, not a great defender in this day and age where there are so many good shortstops, he's never really like the upper echelon of shortstops. Like, he's not in that category of like Bo Bichette, Francisco Lindor, or, even Mookie Betts last year was an elite defensive shortstop. Gunnar Henderson is a little, he's not elite, but he's good enough defensively. Those kind of players. Even Ellie De La Cruz, who's a guy who is like incredibly up and down in terms of his bat and his style of play and his defensive metrics. He's not. You can never really get into that class if you're not a good defensive shortstop, because the better defensive shortstops, or I should say the better shortstops all around in the game, they do it on both ends. They can hit and they can play defense. And then you have obviously guys who are just defensive specialists, and then you have the guys who just hit, and Bo Bichette is one of those guys who just hit. So going over to second base changes the outlook on him a lot, because him going over to second base legitimately makes him one of the better second basemen in the game. Like I said, he, every season that he's played at least 130 games, he's never posted an OPS plus below 121. So if he plays, he's a lock to have an OPS in the low 800s, OPS plus of 120 or higher, hit you 20 home runs. Now, like I said, he doesn't walk a lot. He actually posts in those 3 good years that he had, he's posted good on base numbers because he hits. But it has nothing to do with his plate discipline, because he chases a lot, doesn't strike out a lot. There are so many different ways to go about hitting in the big leagues, and there are so many guys, obviously the superstars like Ohtani and Judge and Soto and all those kind of guys, they do everything. But then you have there are just so many ways to, skin a cat, as they say. And Bo Bichette is one of those guys he's not like a Luis Ariz, who's like a contact guy with no pop. But in a way, he is like a Luis Ariz in terms of making contact and not striking out, but with more pop. So if you look at his Baseball Savant page, he's in the 99th percentile. This was 2025 in expected batting average. So, and when it comes to whiff rate and K rate, 83rd percentile, 86th percentile. So he doesn't strike out and he doesn't swing and miss a lot. But normally when you see guys like that, almost like what Mookie Betts did last year, you see a lot of their underlying metrics, like how hard are they hitting the ball, hard hit rate, their bat speed, their barrel percentage. Usually those numbers are not great. That's not really the case with Bo Bichette. He doesn't have a great barrel percentage, but expected batting average, like I said, 99th percentile, expected slug, 78th percentile, average exit velocity, 72nd percentile, hard hit percentage, 83rd 83rd percentile, excuse me. I know that's a lot of numbers. But basically, Bo Bichette is not just a punch, he's not just like a slap hitter who doesn't strike out, but he's not hitting the ball hard. He does hit the ball hard. He does have pop. Again, when he came up to the big leagues in 2019, he looked like a player that had that kind of MVP potential, 30-plus home run power potential. He's never really become that. Like I said, he kind of does have a ceiling. He's not really like an MVP kind of guy, but he is a legit all-star second baseman. As a second baseman, a legit silver slugger kind of guy. Like I said, if he plays a full season, he's a lock to have an OPS over 800, 20-plus home runs. So he's going to put up – he's basically going to do everything except for play great defense and walk. Other than that, he's going to hit. He's a machine at the plate. And again, if you look at the best second baseman in the game, second base is one of the weaker positions in terms of offense and all that. Ketel Marte is the best second baseman in the game. Pretty much the only offensive second baseman, or I should say he's pretty much the only second baseman that puts up like actual MVP caliber numbers. The other guys behind him, like Jazz Chisholm is probably the second best second baseman in the game. He's a tad below that, but he's a complete like hits for power, great base runner, great defense. After that, I mean, Bryce Strang had a really good season. Brendan Donovan, Drake Cronenworth is a good second baseman. Brandon Lau, if Bo Bichette becomes an everyday second baseman, he probably slots in behind Jazz Chisholm, maybe Bryce Strang because he usually plays great defense. He probably slides in right behind those guys as a top 5 second baseman. Now, when it comes to how is it possible for the Dodgers to get him, how is it possible for him to fit in the contract and all that stuff? Because like I said, after all the numbers I just gave out and his track record, it's pretty clear that he is a really good player and he would really impact the Dodgers lineup. But how does he fit in? Like, how does the contract, how is all that going to work out? And, how did we get here? How is it January 4th and Bo Bichette is not signed to a team? If you do some research and you look at projected contracts, like I said, Tucker is still kind of projected for the 10 years, $400 million, range. I wouldn't be shocked if it went down a little bit. Bo Bichette's all over the place because obviously if he didn't really have these injuries the last 2 years, he'd be looking at a long-term deal, 6, 7, 8 years, over $200 million. He'd be looking at something like that. I think that some of the holdup and, some of the reason he hasn't signed is because I'm sure part of the offseason he was trying to sign as a shortstop. And there's only so many teams in Major League Baseball that need a shortstop and then also can, sign him to the money he's looking for. Like the Pittsburgh Pirates would love to have Bo Bichette. They're not really in that price range, something like that. It came out a couple weeks ago that he is, kind of changed. I don't want to say changed his, his pitch to teams, but he is more willing now to look at himself as a second baseman, and that brings in more teams that are attracted to him. And so now you've heard teams like the Yankees, teams like the Dodgers, the Phillies have even been rumored, the Red Sox, teams like that. Because now he's kind of more willing to play second base. When you look and do some research at what he's projected to get, like I said, there's a lot of 8 years, $212 million, 7 years, $203 million, 8 years, $240 million. I don't think he's getting anywhere close to that. But there is one number, 5 years, $130 million. I think if between him and Tucker, I think Bichette is more likely because I think, Tucker, the only reason Tucker is not going to get a big-time contract is just like sometimes there's just weird times in the market where teams are just not really looking to give a guy a big, long deal like that. And it just might be one of those years for Tucker where it's just not working out for him, and he might need to take an awkward deal, opt out in a year from now after having a big year, and then he'll get that big deal that he's looking for. Bichette is more of in a weird spot because obviously like the position change, like if you're signing Bo Bichette, like, where is he playing? Is he willing to go over and play third base? Is he just best off playing second? Does he want to play short still? And then obviously the injuries. He had calf injuries in 2024. 2025, he had a knee issue. Now, again, I just did a little bit of research, and I realized his knee issue, I believe, was from a collision, like a slide. I don't know if it was on the base path, or if he was like, on the field, like playing shortstop and someone slid into him. That makes me feel a little bit better that if it was like a contact injury instead of just something with his knees given out, like a contact injury that caused the knee issues. All of those reasons are why I believe his value is a little bit like up in the air, and he's probably going to end up having to sign a little bit of a funky deal. Now, unless he goes back to the Blue Jays. So here, I mentioned this earlier, why is all this possible? Kazuma Okamoto, who just signed with the Blue Jays, all right? The Blue Jays have had a pretty wild offseason. They're kind of doing like what the Dodgers did a year ago, just signing a bunch of guys. And he is a third baseman. And he also can play first base, but they obviously have Vladdy there. So basically, what it all comes down to is the Blue Jays sign another position player. It makes it a little bit more difficult for them to bring back Bichette or sign Tucker. Now, I still think, ironically, they're going to get at least one of those guys. I actually think before they signed Okamoto, I thought it was possible that they were going to bring back both. Because ideally you could have Bichette come back and play second base, and then you could sign Kyle Tucker, and he could be one of the corner outfielders. Signing Okamoto kind of means that he's going to be their third baseman. They obviously have Jimenez. They also have Ernie Clement. They also have Addison Barger, who can play the infield. Those guys kind of clog up the infield. They have a lot of outfielders. I just think that Okamoto makes it a little bit more difficult for them to sign a guy like Bichette or Tucker. And I think if you're the Blue Jays, I think that Tucker is like, that's the favorite to land him is the Blue Jays. So let's just say that the Blue Jays land Kyle Tucker, and that kind of closes up their offseason. It kind of leaves Bo Bichette out there to, sign with someone else. And there's been rumors with him in the Yankees. I don't really see that. I see a lot of Yankee fans are clamoring for Bichette. I don't really see the fit there. Because if you sign him, you kind of need him to play shortstop. And I don't think there's anyone that wants him to be their shortstop defensively. I mean, I know Anthony Volpe had like an up and down season last year, and he gets like crapped on so much. But he's a better defensive shortstop than Bo Bichette. And obviously, if you're going to, I don't know if you're going to sign him to play third, and you already have Jazz Chisholm. So I don't really see the fit there. The Red Sox have been rumored. I think that if the Red Sox don't end up with Alex Bregman, that Bo Bichette could be a realistic option for them. The Phillies were rumored. I don't really see the fit there, but I guess if you're signing Bo Bichette, then you're replacing him with Alec Bohm, and then you're trading Alec Bohm. So I think it's a real possibility that Bo Bichette could end up with the Dodgers. I think that, like, they have more interest in him than Tucker, like, actually going after them. I think that Tucker would actually kind of just be more of a, he kind of falls into their lap scenario, where Bo Bichette, I could legitimately see them going after Bo Bichette. Now again, he'd have to be willing, 100%, he'd have to be willing to sign a lesser deal than he expected. I wouldn't even, I think it's even smart for Bo Bichette to sign like a 3-year deal, like $100 million, 3 years, something like that, with opt-outs, come back in 2026, play second base, stay healthy, don't really have those knee issues. You know he's going to post up those good numbers, and then in 2027 you can go back out on the market and get signed to a better deal. And the Dodgers could legitimately go after him, and he would fit nicely into their lineup. Now, I talked about this before in the offseason. What makes that a little complicated / difficult is the Tommy Edman part of it. Tommy Edman obviously is pretty much either going to be your second baseman or your center fielder. And he has had these looming ankle issues, just like Bo Bichette's had these looming knee issues. These looming ankle issues that have kind of handcuffed them. When he's had the ankle issues flare up, he can't really go out and play center field like he would like. He kind of has to just stay at second base, which is fine. He's a good second baseman, but obviously it just hamstrings you. And, if Tommy Edman can't really play center field, are you really able to go sign a guy like Bo Bichette? So Brandon Gomes had this quote. I believe this was at the winter meetings. Tommy Edman did get surgery. I don't know if it was in December or November, but he did get surgery on his ankle. The quote, Edman's recovery will likely leave him limited at the start of spring training, but the team does not expect him to affect meaningful part of the season. So basically what that means is he might come into spring a little bit behind, could even start the year on the IL, but they don't really anticipate it as being like a missing a chunk of the season. I'll be honest, I don't love that because Tommy Edman has dealt with these issues for 2 years now, and if he's going to come into the year kind of has to play himself into shape. I don't mean from his production or from his ability. I mean if he has to play his ankle into shape, I don't really love that. That just sounds like it could flare up again later in the year. But anyways, if you even had to start Tommy Edman on the IL to start the season, I think that it's still there's a strong possibility the Dodgers bring in an outfielder this offseason, whether it's a trade. I still think Lars Nootbaar is a very good fit. But if it's the free agent market, Harrison Bader is a perfect fit. And if you're signing Harrison Bader to a nice 1-2 year deal, that's your center fielder, and you don't really have to worry about Tommy Edman coming back and being able to play center field. So that's pretty much all my thoughts. I didn't want this to be too long of a pod. Obviously, when you're dealing with rumors and stuff like that, it's a little bit of a difficult, not much to talk about other than rumors and is it possible. But I'll say this before we kind of wrap up. The Bo Bichette stuff has gotten me a little juicy, a little interested, I'll be honest. The last couple off seasons, with where the Dodgers roster has been at and the rumors, I haven't had, as a fan, I haven't gone into the offseason oh, they got to sign this guy, or I really hope they sign this guy. I've kind of just sat back and then reacted to whatever they've done, and I've liked all the moves. And, the last time I really went into an offseason they got to get this done was Shohei. Because for years there had been rumors that the Dodgers were saving up money to sign Shohei. They were going to do whatever it took to sign Shohei. So when that offseason came, I was like, all right, show me. Go do it. I've heard all these rumors. Go do it. Don't let him walk and you don't get him. And of course they did sign him, and the rest is history. But, I'm not there with Bo Bichette where if the Dodgers didn't sign him, which at this point I still think it's, if you were to give me a yes or no, I would say no. I would think Bo Bichette either goes back to Toronto. I think there's a fit in Boston. But again, if Tucker ends up with the Blue Jays, and that kind of takes them out of the Bo Bichette sweepstakes, and Alex Bregman goes back to Boston, there's not really a perfect spot for Bo Bichette. And obviously, if you're Bo Bichette, you don't want to take a deal that is you don't want to take a pay cut. You don't want to get a shorter deal. But if you were to take one, why would you not take one to go play with the Dodgers? You're not taking a short-term deal to go play in Pittsburgh, I wouldn't imagine. No offense to Pittsburgh. You take a short-term deal that you can opt out in a year or two, go play second base for the Dodgers. I'm sure he would love to do that. It's just all going to determine on how it all shakes out. So what I was saying was that I'm not at that point where they need to get Bo Bichette or anything like that, but I am at the point where I am excited about that. I'm looking on next, looking to see the rumors, and I'm following it, and I am hoping it happens. That would be pretty cool. The other cool thing about Bo Bichette is that he's very versatile, where he could hit in the lineup. As an analytical person that I am, analytics kind of take out you used to always have a hitter as a profiles as he's a perfect leadoff hitter. He's a prototypical 3-hitter, 4-hitter. Like 30 years ago, Kyle Schwarber, Shohei Ohtani would never be leadoff hitters. They were like cleanup hitters. You have 2 hitters, like Luis Ariz was like a 2-hitter. That's what you would have years ago. Analytics kind of takes a lot of that out nowadays. You don't really see guys like a perfect any kind of hitter. He just kind of hits where the team thinks he's best to produce. But Bichette does have that flexibility where he could be a leadoff hitter. He could hit second. He could hit, if he were to sign with the Dodgers, he'd probably hit like 4th or 5th. But obviously, given the fact that he's a contact hitter and doesn't strike out, you could hit him 6, 7, and he would fit down there too. So that's why I also like Bichette. And the only scary issue with him is just the injuries. But if you consider his age, the fact that he's going to be 28 on opening day next year, which if the Dodgers signed him to a 3-year deal, obviously there would be opt-outs, but say they signed him through a 3-year deal, presumably you would get him for ages 28, 29, 30. That's still very young. And if he puts some of the knee issues behind him, and he's your everyday second baseman, I actually think there's a world. I actually think there's a world where he plays a good second base. I don't think he'd be elite or anything like that, but he could be an average second baseman defensively. And the offense, you're going to have your second baseman with an 800 OPS. That's pretty, there aren't many of those guys. There is not more than 5 guys who can really do that at the second base position. So we'll see what happens. As always, you guys never know what's going to happen. As always, whenever there is a rumor or some news, I should say, something that breaks, I'll hop on here and we'll break it down. I really would like to see Bichette. I think he is a good fit, but as always, we'll see what happens. Still going to be a difficult situation. We'll see how it plays out. So as always, thank you guys so much for listening. Again, I hope you guys had a really good holiday season, a good new year. Happy New Year. 2026 is here. It's now 2025 is a thing of the past. The Dodgers, the back-to-back champs, that's all the thing of the past. Now it is time to focus on a three-peat. It's time to get that 3rd World Series, 2026. So, as always, you can get this podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow us on Talking Blue Pod on X. You can follow myself on Talking Blue Nick as well on X. And you can follow us on Reddit at competitive-week8715. Thank you guys so much for listening. We will see you guys very shortly in the next couple days or weeks. Any Dodgers news, we'll hop on here. Thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed.